Hello and welcome. My name's Annie and I'm an intern at the Peggy Guggenheim Collection, and today I'd like to invite you on a Tancredi tour of Venice. Okay, so before we set off for our first destination, which is not very far away, I'd like you to stop for a moment and try and imagine what it must have been like to be a young, sensitive artist growing up during World War II, when the battleground was right here on your doorstep. When Tancredi was born in 1927, in Feltre, Veneto, which is about 100 kilometres north of here, Italy was a dictatorship under Mussolini. In 1943, when Tancredi was 16 and he left for Venice to study art, the Allies were just landing in the south of Italy. After that, Italy switched sides and the Germans then invaded from the north. And it wasn't until April 1945 that the Allies liberated Venice. By August of that same year, the United States had dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima to finally end the war. More than 60 million people had died, and that figure rises to more than 80 million if you include the disease and famine caused by the war, and a huge percentage of those were just civilians. Then, almost immediately after the Second World War ended, the Cold War began. So that is the backdrop to Tancredi's life, and it's a lot of death and destruction for any human being to assimilate, let alone a young, sensitive artist. So in 1943, Tancredi Parmigiani, known simply as Tancredi, came here to Venice to study at the Accademia di Belle Arti, exchanging his sturdy mountains of his home for this watery lagoon. We are now standing on the Accademia landing station that is used for the Vaporetto, and this, as well as that large bridge behind you, were both named after this Accademia Belle Arti that's just here. And this academia was here in Tancredi's time, but that was not always the case. It was originally founded in 1750 in a room on the upper floor of the flour warehouse on the Grand Canal, close to Piazza San Marco, a landmark that I'm sure you all know. The space there was just not sufficient, and students and teachers had to contend with the noise and dust of the market, which also occupied the first floor of the building. So in 1807, under Napoleonic decree, the Scuola della Carità, as it was then called, was opened here on the south bank of the Grand Canal. The art school and its wonderful galleria of associated artworks became separate bodies in 1879, but they've remained in the same building until 2004. The galleria is still here, but the present Accademia is 5 minutes further away on the other side of the promontory, in a building known as the Ospitali degli Incurabili. While he was studying here, Tancredi became very good friends with Emilio Vedova, a young Venetian painter who had fought in the resistance and would go on to become perhaps Italy's best-known abstract expressionist. This was potentially a great time for these young abstract artists to develop their ideas. For nearly 2 decades, Italian art had been dominated by figurative masters such as Giorgio de Chirico and Mario Sironi, but change was in the air and the fascist style was no longer fashionable. Abstraction, which had all but disappeared in previous years, now seemed rich with possibilities. In 1946, when Tancredi finished here, he was 19, and he decided to leave for Paris and hooked up with the progressive avant-garde movement there. He returned to Italy and for the next couple of years lived in both Feltre and Venice. Okay, so our next stop is for 1948, when Tancredi attended the Biennale. So now we need to take the Vaporetto, number 1, and we will get off at the Giardini stop. Okay, so here we are at the Giardini stop, and if you would like to follow me through the garden, the site of the Biennale is just up here. Right, so the National Biennale exhibition of Italian art was created by the Venetian City Council in 1893, and a year later this was expanded to include other international artists, but only by invitation. This Biennale was created to show contemporary visual art every other year, and has now been expanded to include an architectural Biennale in the years in between. So this year, everyone would normally be getting ready to open the Architectural Biennale, and this place would be a hive of activity. The Art Biennale here in Venice was the original Biennale on which all the others in the world have been modelled, and it really put Venice on the map as an important player in the contemporary art world. The Arsenale, which is the original shipbuilding yard upon which Venice became such an important naval power, and that some of you may know and have visited as part of the present-day Biennale, that was not opened until relatively recently in 1999. So Tancredi came here to visit the Biennale in 1948, and there was a lot of excitement because this was its first staging since it had been closed for the war, during which time the fascists and the Nazis had proclaimed that modern art was, as they termed it, degenerate, and much of it had been suppressed or even destroyed. Tancredi found himself particularly fascinated by the Greek pavilion, known during this Biennale as the Guggenheim Pavilion, as it had been offered to Peggy Guggenheim because the Greeks were involved in a civil war. Peggy was really entertained by the fact that alongside countries such as France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, her pavilion was listed as Guggenheim, as if it was so important as to be a country of its own. Peggy was displaying her exciting collection here, including the work of the American abstract expressionists that she had just brought back with her from New York. And Tancredi saw new radically different styles of artworks created by artists he'd only heard about, such as Pollock, Mondrian, and Kandinsky. Within this Biennale, there were also other protagonists of contemporary art, including Chagall, Klee, Braque, and Magritte, as well as a retrospective of Picasso's work. Tancredi was really inspired, having seen all of this, and he set to work on his own canvases. He achieved his first solo exhibition at the Gallery Sandri here in Venice the following year at the age of only 22. He then moved to Rome for a short time, and his work was shown as part of the exhibition of the Italian abstract art at the Galleria Nazionale d'Arte Moderna. That brings us up to 1951. Tancredi returns from Venice and formally meets Peggy Guggenheim. Thanks to her influence, he literally gets up close and personal with abstract expressionism. So the next stop in our tour is the Palazzo Venia dei Leoni, home to both Peggy and her collection from 1949. So to get there, we need to get back on the Vaporetto number 1 and return to the Accademia stop that we came from earlier. Okay, so here we are. If you'd like to follow me, we will take a 5-minute walk to Peggy's home. I think it's very interesting that Peggy Guggenheim only put 2 artists under contract in her lifetime. The first was the American Jackson Pollock, and the second was Tancredi. Her support meant that he suddenly found himself playing in the major league of the world of art, even though he was not yet 25. Peggy not only supported Tancredi financially, she also gave him a small studio space to work in her basement. He was the only other artist, apart from Pegine, her daughter, to have ever had a study there. Peggy took the young Tancredi under her wing, making it her mission that he would achieve international acclaim. Okay, so if you'd be kind enough to put on these augmented reality glasses, I'd like to show you some of the work that he was producing at this time. These are a selection of works still in Peggy's collection, and several are out on show, that you can come back and visit and see for yourself once the collection has reopened. I only wish I could put you in a time capsule as well, because in 2016-17 there was the most wonderful Tancredi retrospective here at the Guggenheim, which saw the largest visitor numbers since the museum opened in 1980 and an 80% rise in the use of its social media channels. But by putting on these glasses, we can still see that during these years his work is full of experimentation, trying out all the various ideas that have influenced him in the last few years, both inside and outside of Peggy's collection. Perhaps these tangled, looped lines of colour reflect his admiration of Jackson Pollock's work that he was seeing all the time here. He was also inspired by Mondrian's belief that the world could be reduced to pure forms and primary colours. And all of this was mixed together in his head and then further influenced by being a member of the Spazialismo movement, within which he developed the idea of infinite space through the exploration of the relationships between the painted mark, colour, and light. He believed that art should both reach into and reflect the entire cosmos, and later he begins to feel that the space is curved. I think you can see how this is reflected in his work as he starts to find his own style of personal language. The 1950s are a time when his work receives a lot of attention and publicity. In 1952, he's awarded the Graziano Prize for Painting in Venice, and between 1952 and 1959, he has 4 solo shows at the Galleria di Cavallino. This was a very important Venetian art gallery, founded in 1942 by Carlo Cardazzo, who actively promoted the 20th century avant-garde artists in Venice and also encouraged many European artists who had previously been centred by fascism. He encouraged them to come back to Italy. In 1954, Tancredi wanted to be part of the Venice Biennale, so he sent some of his works to be seen by the jury, but disappointingly his work was refused. But things do pick up for him a bit, because in the same year, Peggy sets up a double personal exhibition called Tancredi Peggin here at the Palazzo Venia di Leone, and it is a big success. It's not entirely clear whether it was his reported infatuation for Peggin Vale, Peggy's daughter, or his stormy economic relationships that causes a final breakdown in his relationship with Peggy by the end of 1955. But during the following years, they continue to exchange letters, and perhaps more importantly, Peggy continues to play a strategic role in the promotion of his work, both here in Italy and in the United States and London, by undertaking a targeted donation campaign to private collectors and important museums, such as the MoMA in New York. In 1958, this resulted in his being invited to show his work in solo exhibitions both in London and New York, and in the same year he married Norwegian painter Tove Dietrichson, with whom he had 2 children. The following year, in 1959, he decides to move to Paris, and so the Galleria de Cavallino here in Venice organised a tribute exhibition entitled Venice Greets Tancredi. In April 1960, Tancredi participated in the first anti-process demonstration, organised by Lebel and Geoffroy at the Galleria des Quatre Saisons in Paris. It was a demonstration against the trial held in Cape Town in 1959 of some anti-apartheid activists, including Nelson Mandela. This demonstration was repeated again here in Venice in June of the same year in 1960 at the Il Canale Gallery. A few days later, in the same gallery, Tancredi created some provocative works as an act of radical protest against the system of art and culture. He called it formal art and informal art, and it consisted of 2 large rolls of painted loo paper that visitors could tear at will. As the Cold War continued to build and the world felt like it was growing ever more perilous, Tancredi started to unravel emotionally, and he became more erratic, reflected both in his writing and in his work. In 1962, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and from then on he found himself periodically hospitalized. He fought back by creating images of nature and gardens, using bright, bold colours. His series of collages entitled Country Diaries married gritty, sardonic irony with a genuinely innocent love of the natural world. The horrors of the wider world were now closing in on Tancredi, and he created 3 works as a series dedicated to Hiroshima. In response to these global conflicts, he touchingly wrote, "My weapon against the atom bomb is a blade of grass." In 1964, he was finally invited to partake in the Venice Biennale where his work was shown, but by then he'd already been hospitalised for much of the previous year, and in September the 27th, just 2 days after his 37th birthday, he threw himself into the Tiber in Rome. One of the notes he left behind said, "Life is still entirely to be discovered." Peggy Guggenheim described the death of her protégé as both a sad loss to humanity and to art. Thank you very much for listening.